So imagine it for a moment. You're at Square, the GOAT known as Takahashi, and after dropping the absolute fucking masterpiece that was Xenogears, you want to try to focus on putting more of this world you've created out there. Except there's a small problem. Square is not interested in pushing your world forward, and wants to develop their time and resources to focus more on their hit series, The Bouncer. And Final Fantasy II, but that's whatever. With no plans whatsoever to push forward on the Xenogames. As their creator, you're frustrated that you won't be able to make more of your world, and that Square is just going to stick to the one thing that works. So, you decide to leave, and after some searching high up in the mountains, you end up at Bandai Namco, who let you create the vision you've always had, and thus the birth of the Xenosaga trilogy happened. I figured now that we've just wrapped up our Xenogears review a little while back, it was time to move on to this trilogy. And I have to admit, I've been excited to tackle these games for a while. I've always heard mention of just how phenomenal this entire trilogy is, the second game notwithstanding. I've wanted to see for a long time if their legends hold up, as we continue on with this Xeno Marathon. With that said, that's enough talking for an intro. So let's get into my review of Xenosaga, Episode 1, Friser zu Walzenberg. To start things off, as I usually do in one of these reviews, I want to talk about what I liked in the graphics department first. Because, to be honest, I was pretty impressed by how good this game still looked all these years later. PS2 graphics are a very interesting era to look back on, as that was the system era where we started to get less of the more blocky, chunky looks from the PS1 and N64 games, and we were turning 3D graphics into a much more professional looking product. And well, that was the case for a lot of the titles in that time. There were some games that, when you went back to them in that era, they didn't really age all that well. Thankfully, Xenosaga's first episode does not suffer from that, as many aspects of the game still look great many years later. Character models were incredibly well designed and distinguishable from one to the other. Several areas you explore looked great with nice uses of lighting, alongside attaching a fixed camera angle to help enhance shots to give them more of a punchy feeling once you see them. And the cutscenes themselves were pretty impressive for the time. It still ran into a couple problems that PS2 era JRPGs faced, like the faces not being all that expressive, which works in the case of characters like Momo or Cosmos, considering they're supposed to be robots, but for everyone else it kind of sticks out. Similar to the original Kingdom Hearts, where Goofy and Donald were very expressive, most of the time Sora has that blank look on his face. But honestly, that's just a drop in the bucket to just how solid this game looks visually overall. And if I had to pick my favorite area of the game, it's probably the Cuckoo Foundation. I know it's called the Kukui Foundation, but I just want to call it just different names throughout this whole video, so we're going to do that instead. The Kaka Foundation has this really high futuristic building feel that I kind of wish we got to see more of, because it really captures the kind of buildings you would see in space. Plus you get to see Shion in a bikini, and well, who can't love that? Also, massive props for setting this game in space. I feel like a lot of RPGs never try to take advantage of that. Okay, so let me rephrase. I feel like a lot of good RPGs never really try to take advantage of that. I feel like Star Ocean's the only one that really tries to run with that, but for the most part you usually spend time on one planet in those games. Combat animations also hold up pretty well too. Speaking of combat, let's wrap up talking about how the game looks and talk about how it plays. So, Xenosaga, as you can probably guess, follows in the footsteps of Gears gameplay. You're given a specific amount of actions per turn, and through button combos, you're able to utilize death blows to do as much damage to the enemy as possible. And while at first, it may just seem like another one-to-one recreation of Gears' combat, but it actually does a lot, and I mean a lot, to differentiate itself. For one, the amount of your actions no longer increases through levels, and now begins and ends at 3. When I first saw this was a change that I was kind of split on, as this meant the really cool long combos we were able to do were now going away. But after thinking about it, it's a change for the better. It was cool to have those 9 options, but by the end game, the only real reason to even use them was so you can utilize the multiple death blow system, a mechanic that honestly barely ever was utilized in the first place due to just how easy Gears was. So it being removed makes sense, even if I will miss doing thousands of damage in one go. So how does the new system fare in comparison to the old one? Well, for one, it actively seems to have a lot more of a focus on strategizing. Like I said, you only have a maximum of 3 actions, but every battle you start with only 2 of those 3 action points. Every turn, you get 2 more. Each action you take takes up a point, with items taking 1.5. As a result, you have to pick and choose what you want to do with your actions much more carefully. Do you launch an all-out attack with all of your actions, or use one and wait until the next turn to have a full gauge to use more actions? Where when you get a full gauge, you can finally launch one of your death blows. Those aren't the only factors you have to pay attention to though, as there is another gauge you're filling up over time, known as your boost gauge. This gauge can only be filled out by hitting your opponent with attacks, and once you get a full gauge, which seems to go up to 3, you can activate it, and it allows you to completely skip forward and make it your turn next. If you pull off the boost gauge right, you can essentially get like 5 to 7 turns in a row, and god is it fun to master. I remember pulling this on the final boss and draining half of his health through it alone. It is really enjoyable to utilize once you've mastered it. Of course, it does come with a couple downsides, so it isn't too overpowered. For one, you can't use a party member's boost if they have a turn coming up. And the other was that your opponents can also utilize this as well, with their boosts being able to completely override yours, which can end up turning some boss fights into some pretty do-or-die scenarios. Of course, there was one other bar you had to pay attention to, as Xenosaga continues the trend of PS2-era JRPGs utilizing Final Fantasy X's timeline bar, but instead of just being a carbon copy of it, it actually introduces a couple really cool mechanics to it. So next to the bar is this interchangeable little slot that gives a boost to whoever it lands on. One of the boosts is increasing the amount of boost gauge you get, one increases the chance of criticals, another is a point multiplier. It's this little bit of flavor added to it that gets you to pay more attention to the turn order than normal. After all, if you aren't, you could miss out a chance to gain a lot of boost, or your opponent could take advantage of it and deal a bunch of damage to you. If you need a visualization of what it looks like other than what's on the screen, another series that kind of does this well is The Legend of Heroes, or just Trails in short. Man, I miss reviewing those games. I cannot wait for Daybreak 2 to finally release in the West. I am so excited for that. With that stated, that covers the more basic aspects of the game's combat. So now let's get into the stuff that's more under the hood, aka all the new upgradable stuff. So Saga didn't just swap around abilities and attacks and call it a day, and instead decided to add in multiple different points you can use to improve your characters. First of all was tech points. These are what you spend if you want to increase the strength of your death blows or give your characters permanent stat buffs. These are points you're going to be spending the most time with, considering death blows are such a vital part of gameplay, and your stats are, well, your stats. The second is ether points. These are spent to improve your ether skills and unlock new abilities. The 3 characters utilizing this one the most will be Shion, Momo, and Chaos, as they are your main ether users and also sort of your healers. Ether can also be transferred over to another, meaning if there's a skill that you feel benefits another character, you can move it over to them, which can allow for a lot of fun creative character mixes that all comes down to how you think they should be used. And then the last is skill points, which can be used to activate the new extract skill mechanic, where by spending points, you can extract skills from items and equip them to your characters. Which means if you have an ability that's all about +2 power on a piece of equipment, you can extract that and equip it to your character. And utilizing this correctly allows you to have up to 6 passive skills at once. However, you can only equip up to 3 skills at the same time, so a major aspect is mixing and matching which one works the best. It also helps that this game is actually kind of difficult at points, which was a nice change of pace from something like Xenogears, where you tore through pretty much every fight in the game. It was nice to actually sweat a little bit when trying to defeat these enemies. Takahashi and his team really improved a lot of this gameplay, and while it's still not a perfect system, which we will get to in a little bit, it's pretty much 90% perfect, and that's pretty good. That's still an A-. And that's all I really have to say about combat. So let's get into Saga's story and characters. Now, considering that this was the first part of a 3-part narrative, I assumed it was going to fall into the trappings a lot of those other first trilogy games did. Things like slow pacing, awkward exposition dumping, pretty janky character introduction at points. But surprisingly enough, Saga is very good at not falling into any of those. Like, there's the awkward exposition dump here and there, but for the most part, the game is very well paced. And throughout most of the exposition dumps, they are usually tied into character moments. So I want to give a little round of applause to that. Good job, Takahashi. You avoided what a lot of other games suffer from. So what is this story even about anyways? Well, it follows the protagonist known as Shion as she has to escape when her ship is destroyed by a giant swarm of monsters known as the Gnosis, with a small crew as she tries to figure out how to stop an extraterrestrial threat that's been revealed, known simply as Udu. All the while dealing with this strange cult-like organization known as the Utic organization. But considering it's the first game of the trilogy, a lot of the focus is on introducing the cast and world. showing you the many personalities you'll be dealing with and introductions to this ecosystem, alongside the flaws this world has. Personally, I loved it, especially all the characters we're introduced to, as outside of one we will talk to later, are all really interesting and just really likable. The main lead of the game, Shion, has a good head on her shoulders, and her arc tackling one of the game's major subplots about robots, known as realians in this game, being treated poorly and deserve to be treated as real people, which in turn ties her to another character, her own creation Cosmos, an android she built with the help of her team on the space station, is handled rather well and creates a very interesting dynamic, especially with how they write Cosmos. I think the best moment of this arc so far is in the prologue chapter, where there's this racist guy who keeps talking down on the Realians, and she just guns him down towards the end. And at first, she had assumed that Cosmos did this because of the racism, or, because he was just straight up a dick. But in reality, Cosmos only killed him because her orders were to keep Shion's group alive. She didn't have any hatred for him. She didn't do it because he was an enemy. He was just in the way, plain and simple. It's cold and cruel, but it absolutely makes sense that a robot would think this way. She didn't do anything wrong in her eyes. She was just following orders. It's gonna be a really interesting case to see where they take this. Especially since in the late game of episode 1, there is a massive revelation, and I won't say what it is, but it is pretty dope, and honestly crazy. Of course, those two aren't the only interesting characters. There's also Ziggurat 9, or Ziggy for short, a man who wants to fully become a machine due to the traumatic events in his past, which aren't super focused on, but it is heavily implied that he lost some family members. That's probably going to be tackled in game number 2, but it does seem like they're setting up this father-daughter bond with another Realian known as Momo, a robot that had a father-daughter relationship with the man who is apparently the reason the monsters known as the Gnosis are in the universe. Then there's Junior, this literal child soldier that's heavily implied to have a crush on Momo, but while he's also cool, he and everyone else are unfortunately outshined by the best character in the game, the main antagonist, Albedo, who radiates the level of unhinged autistic riz that no JRPG fan is safe from. The best moment of his being the reveal that he's immortal, and you just watch him rip his own fucking head off while laughing like a madman. Boy oh boy, the performance is just doing numbers. It's crazy good. Just listen to this.
Ah, ma belle pêche. There's no need to tremble like that. Else, you'll make me feel like a pêche myself.
Would you believe me if I told you this was the same guy who did Itachi? Yeah, amazing voice work here, Crispin Freeman. You deserve a medal. I think he's the main guy I want to see the most out of as this trilogy goes on. I'm very curious to see what they do with this unhinged madman and his relationship to Junior. That's all I really have to say about story characters. So on to my last bit of praise, and that is that the music is fantastic. As you might expect, Saga had a lot of people returning from Xenogears to work on it, and one of those was the composer, Yasunori Mitsuda. While I admit I do not think his Saga soundtrack is as good as his Gears soundtrack, it still sounds amazing, especially the boss theme. I love that it has this feel of otherworldly dread, like you're battling some cosmic horror, and given all the things you fight, he wasn't exactly wrong to make it that way. And well, that's all I really have to say in terms of pros. Just an overall super solid game. But now, let's get into my issues. So now that I have gone through what I think Xenosaga Episode 1 does so well, let's get into what I think it does wrong. If I'm being honest though, I don't think this series' first entry does a whole lot wrong. It got a lot more right than what I was expecting it to for a first entry to a trilogy, and it made me genuinely excited to see what more this series has to offer. But I won't deny that there weren't a few things that I had a problem with. So let's get into talking about them. We'll start off with combat first. Now, while I still stand by my pros about this combat being downright great, there were a few aspects of it I feel were pretty mishandled. For one was the inclusion of mechs in combat, known as AGWSs. I don't like that name actually. Let's just call them Big Mechs. We're gonna call them Big Mechs. Big Mechs feel like they were the most forgettable part of the game. My guess is that Takahashi wanted to evolve on the concept of gears by letting you enter these in battle whenever you wanted. Not a bad idea, sure. However, they come with a small issue. It's the fact that you never really have to use them in the first place. Having giant monsters that roamed the land and several boss fights dedicated to using the gears made them actually viable concepts to utilize in battle, and it gave them a legitimate reason to be there. In this game, there aren't any enemies like that. All of them can be beaten outside of the robots. As a result, you never really have a reason to use them, so they just start rotting away and becoming more and more forgotten. Outside of, I think, 2 times they're actually mandatory? It actually makes me wish that this game included more bosses that force you to actually use them. Like, we're exploring the vast reaches of space here, why not have space dungeons dedicated to using the Big Mechs? That honestly would have been rad to have dungeons dedicated to you traveling around in your Big Mechs. But instead, it just becomes the most forgettable aspect of the gameplay. Which is something I do also have to say about the movement system. Yeah, so in comparison to Gears, in Saga, you have the ability to move your character around during battle through the movement option. Like the mechs, it's a cool idea that is barely touched upon. I think maybe 1 or 2 of the bosses actually take advantage of it and knock you out of your spot, and I don't remember any normal enemies actually using it to their advantage as well. As a result, it just kind of sits there, doing nothing until the end of time. What a sad existence it has. It's like the Starscream of mechanics. I do kind of hope that later entries start finding ways to use it, as it would have been really cool to have bosses with insta-kills that you dodged by moving out of the way, or just anything to utilize a movement strategy. There's a genuine layer of strategy here that's just begging to be used. Praying that Episode 2 takes advantage of it. Like I said earlier, there is a lot of potential to make one of the coolest combat systems ever if they just use these 2 tools more effectively. Guess I'll see that when I start the second one. That's all I really had to say about combat though, so I think it's time we got into the story and character issues. Now for these, there's actually only one major issue each for both of them. So we'll start with the story first. Like I said earlier, it's pretty good. This is the first of a trilogy, and I think the first game was very well paced, well executed. There's pretty much no problems with the game's story outside of one moment. That moment is none other than the rescue mission in the Kuki Foundation. So, for a bit of context, at one point in the story, the Cuckoo Foundation is attacked by a giant swarm of Gnosis, and Shion's group goes to help out by rescuing civilians that are in danger. A simple concept that, while used as a way to pad out the game, could have been fun if it was utilized well. But it's here, so it wasn't. But it could have been. The 2 biggest issues of this section stem from 1, the amount of civilians you have to save is absurdly high. You'd think that for like a rescue mission, they'd do something simple, like, 3 or 5 or maybe 8 at the most. How about 13? Yeah, there are 13 you have to save, and some of these are absurdly obtuse to find. Like, you have to take an entirely hidden pathway all the way up to slide down to a dumpster, blow up the dumpster, and then you find them. That's finding one of them. And 2, pretty much every enemy here is the most annoying enemy you have to fight in the game. Bugbears have these really high health bars and can heal themselves, and leech dolls can only be killed by healing. A cool idea, but they're ruined by the fact that they can break off their body part and just make the fights longer. Genuinely the only enemy in the game where I felt like my time was being wasted while fighting them. Outside of that, no more story complaints. Now on to my complaints about characters. And as I stated earlier, I love pretty much every cast member, even the minor ones like the cargo ship crewmates that take you in after your original ship blows up. However, there's one character I wasn't fond of, at all, and that was Alan. One of Shion's co-workers who survived along with her, and boy oh boy, he is easily the worst part of this game. I can't think of a single moment I liked having him on screen. I'm pretty sure he's meant to be the normal guy in the big situation that we're supposed to relate to and cry for and hope he does well. But no, instead, every time I saw him on screen, I wanted to stop stream, end for the night, and turn off the game. I get it's the first game in the trilogy, so he could probably get better, but holy shit, he might be the single most annoying character. I can't think of a single moment where he's not whining or being petty that she don't need anything, you never did, you do him. Women don't talk to me, and I don't act like this. Forget you heard that. What were we talking about? Oh yeah, he has no development whatsoever. He contributes nothing to what's going on, and his voice is like fucking nails on a goddamn chalkboard. Who even voiced this guy? Dave Wittenberg? The voice of Kakashi? Bro, why do you keep asking him to high-pitch his voice? It didn't work for Gaspar and .hack.gu, and it doesn't work here. Whew. Alright, that's it. Those are all my cons, so let's move on to my final thoughts. Episode 1 of Xenosaga had flaws. Shocker, I know. A game with flaws, crazy. However, even with its issues, I genuinely think this might be what I can consider a near perfect beginning to this trilogy, and I am genuinely excited to see what the second episode is going to bring. That is why my final rating for this game is an overwhelmingly positive 9.5 out of 10. And with that, we have reached the end of the video. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'm genuinely happy I was able to get this one out much faster than I did than the Gears video. I'll try to do the same for the second episode. And if you want to follow along on this journey, make sure you like and sub down below, hit the bell for that beautiful little notification for when videos go live, leave a comment if you want to talk about the review, or if you just want to have a chat for the hell of it, and I hope you all have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time for more RPG content.